Good evening. 1 week from now, Tharman Shanmugaratnam will resign from government to stand for president. Businessman George Goh has also announced his intention to run. Will there be a contest? Who will win and by what margin? Tonight, we won't be engaging in any punditry, so don't count on us to help you win any bets. Instead, over the next 90 minutes, we'll be talking about the institution of the presidency, how it's supposed to work, and why, after more than 30 years, it remains highly controversial. Political scientists consider a democratic system to be consolidated when it's accepted as the only game in town. By that measure, I think our parliamentary system could be considered pretty consolidated. In GE season, candidates and voters just get on with the job. But in contrast, 3 months before we have to pick a new president, Singaporeans are still debating first principles about the presidency. And so when we asked audience members to submit questions and comments that they might have about the for Kevin, I was struck by the number that went beyond, for example, the details about this upcoming presidential election, and instead focused on really big picture questions. Should the presidential elections be eliminated entirely? Given the political costs of each PE, do you see government changing the constitution to revert to an appointed president? Would it be better to have a contested election for the presidency or go back to an appointed one? There were many more such questions looking at quite fundamental questions. And although we're supposed to pick a winner in a couple of months, it looks like many Singaporeans are not even sure if the game has been set up properly or if there's any point to it. If these questions indeed were put to a referendum, I'm confident Singaporeans would vote overwhelmingly to retain parliamentary elections. Whether they would choose to keep presidential elections, I'm not so sure. To help us navigate these doubts and controversies, we can think of no better guide than Professor Kevin Tan. With a doctorate from Yale Law School, Kevin has for decades been one of Singapore's foremost scholars in constitutional law. In the late 1990s, when President Ong Teng Cheong was quarreling with cabinet and needed independent inputs, Kevin was one of the constitutional advisors he turned to. This did not endear him to Lee Kuan Yew when Kevin was quoted in a Straits Times report saying that the presidency had become terribly confusing. LKY launched a personal attack in Parliament, saying that Kevin had not read the Constitution and suggesting that he was unfit to teach in a law school. This was 1999. I leave it to you to judge if Kevin's assessment that this is a kind of a confusing institution has withstood the test of time. In any case, my colleagues and I at Academia SG don't rely on politicians to tell us which scholars are worth paying attention to. We try to circulate ideas from the academic community that we believe can add to our public discourse. Our lecture series is reserved for the MVPs of our sport, academics with a lifetime of rigorous, peer-reviewed scholarly contributions to the study of Singapore. Professor Kevin Tan is eminently qualified, and it's my great honor now to invite him to speak.
Thank you so much, Cherian, for that little trip down memory lane. It's amazing. It's like 25 years since Lee Kuan Yew decided that I had not read the Constitution. I assure you I did, and I continue to do so. So thank you very much for inviting me to give this sort of a little bit of a primer, and then for us to have a conversation about the institution of the elected presidency. And of course, we know that come early September, we are going to have the next presidential election, right? So maybe for those who are joining us, and I realize that actually we've got quite a nice crowd here, to take you through a little bit about the origins of the scheme and then to try and understand where we are going with that. So with that, I prepared some slides. So today we are talking about presidential expectations, what the Constitution requires, and the political dynamics of our hybridized head of state. Let us begin with the reason why we have the elected presidency. The reason why we have an elected presidency was this. Now, between 1968 and 1981, the PAP had won every single seat in Parliament. It was described as a hegemonic hold on Parliament. As you know, for people who always score A's in their exams, the moment they get a A- or a B+, seems like the end of the world. Well, this is something that happened, but and kind of triggered Lee Kuan Yew into thinking about what could be done in the event that you had a so-called freak election. So the specter of a freak election was what led to the creation of the elected presidency. So here I've just given you some figures. General election, as you can see, the PAP was registering these very huge majorities between 1968 and 1980. In fact, nothing less than 70%. Now, we did see voter swings, and this is what they were watching for. Between 1968 and 1972, there was a voter swing of 16%. That didn't seem to worry them too much at that time because basically there was no effective opposition or credible opposition who could actually challenge their supremacy. But what happened in Anson by-election, the Anson by-election of 1981 really caused a major rethink of this particular situation. In the 1980 general election, the PAP won a 77.7% majority in the election itself. So that's for all the constituencies. For Anson, it was C.V. Devan Nair, and he won way above the national average. He actually got 84.1%. So PAP going into the 1981 by-election was quite confident that they could, maybe not equal Devan Nair's popularity, but he still hit a fairly good number. To their utter consternation, they lost to J.B. Jeyaretnam, and Pang Kim Hin, the candidate for Anson that year, scored only 47.1%. So this statistic is the one that caused Lee Kuan Yew, sleepless nights. There was a voter swing away from the PAP of 37%. Okay, so what happens if you see that on a national level? This is what they're worried about. So he said he spent 15 years thinking what could happen if there was a freak election. What would happen? How would you ensure that Singapore didn't, sort of return to the dark ages if, some other government came to power? Now, this was very revealing. In fact, I quote this particular response that he gave in a 2009 dialogue following the 5th anniversary dinner of the Institute of Policy Studies. And at that dinner, Catherine Lim, the writer-commentator, stood up and she actually asked him, she said, well, if you have a freak election result, will you do the unthinkable and send in the army, right? So this was it. And he said, well, and he laughed it off. He says, okay, you're a writer of fiction. I don't know what you dream about, but this is not what we consider to be the case. So he started off the reply by quoting his teacher at LSE, where he spent a couple of months with Harold Lasky, and he said something that Harold Lasky said was always on his mind. He said, if you don't have a system which allows for revolutionary change, right, and fundamental change by consent, then you will have a revolution by violence. So the stakes are very high. If society is going to change, if there's going to be a major fundamental change, you must engineer a system that will allow that change to take place by consent, everybody's agreement. Because if you shut down every possibility of consensus, of the democratic decision-making, of deliberation, then you will invariably end up with a revolution by violence, right? So he said, well, that lesson remained very much in his mind. And he said, well, if we have a freak election, right, or any election, the PAP is out of government, what do you do? And this is quote-worthy. He says, first, we maintain the system that gives any opposition the opportunity to displace us peacefully. And we allow the system. We have not interfered with the civil service. We've not interfered with the judiciary. We've not interfered with the parliamentary procedures or the system, police, and so on. And if you can win election, so be it. And at some time, some place, we will be unable to find a team that can equal an opposition team. He's talking about the PAP, right? And that day we deserve to be out. Now, if we become corrupt, we become inefficient, we can't deliver, we're out. So he was a political realist in that sense. However, he said, we expect that if we get voted out, we stay out, all right? And hopefully within one term, that new government, incompetent, unable to deliver, will lose the next election. All right. So in other words, the whole purpose of the presidential elected presidency system is to hold the situation for at least 5 years, right? For the duration of that parliamentary term. Maybe the PAP gets its guns together, it comes back, it wins, and then he says there is enough core competency and funds to enable the fresh PAP to revive the system, right? So you lose power, you stay out, but they are not able to ruin the country completely in that 5-year interregnum before you come back. Okay, so this is the thinking behind it. So how did this then become the elected presidency? Well, they said, well, if we are thinking of an institution of this sort with this kind of design, and we have certain considerations, it leads invariably to the idea that it would be an elected president. There are 5 main considerations. Number 1, you have to preserve the parliamentary system of government. Number 2, whatever mechanism you have must be able to act and respond very quickly. Third, the institution should have high moral authority, right? So to be able to control the government of the day. Fourth, the president must have ministerial, high executive or administrative experience to balance the demands of political expediency and the public interest. Now, I want you to bear this in mind, okay? They are talking about some experience for what, right? To balance demands of political expediency and public interest. It doesn't talk about some kind of experience in running a mega company, all right? It doesn't talk about that. It just simply talks about having this administrative experience so you can know, right, what's in political expedient and how that should be countered against sort of public policy, public interest. And finally, it was important to entrench this in the Constitution. Now, why do you have number 5? Because if you take what Lee Kuan Yew said earlier, well, the idea is that you want to preserve the system for at least one parliamentary term so that the PAP can come back into power. Well, if you don't entrench it in the Constitution, then what could happen is that it could simply be abolished, right? You could simply get rid of the elected presidency scheme. Then you open the larder and then you raid it, right? So this is the idea that you've got to entrench it in the Constitution. So what have they done? What have we done? Okay, so here very quickly, I don't want to go too much into elaboration, but here's just a timeline of the developments that have taken place, significant developments that have taken place in respect of the elected presidency office. It starts in 1984. Most people don't realize this. It actually started when the PAP popularity vote dropped to 64.8%. There was a 12.9% vote against the PAP, and they lost both Anson and Potong Pasir. And those of us who are old enough to remember this, I remember staying up to watch the results, and Lee Kuan Yew and in fact all the other ministers in the team looked like they were, just going to some funeral because it looked like they lost the election. They won the election, but he was really furious, and he started scolding Singaporeans for playing around with their votes. And maybe we should revise the one man, one vote system. Maybe we should give people who have children and people who are above the age of 35 2 votes and everybody else 1 vote, right? So he was really sort of lashing out, really furious that, if you could have this swing. He said the nightmare would be if there's another 16% swing, we are out of power. Right? Imagine waking up with no PAP in power. This was 1984. George Orwell too, right? So it was a nightmare scenario, and 14% swing, not for 16. We have been out of power. So here he was already saying we've got to do something. He floated a trial balloon. He talked about it. It was just reported in the newspapers with not much elaboration that maybe we should transform the office of the president into an elected one. The first serious white paper came about in 1988, proposing constitutional changes. This was very hotly debated, and this led to a second white paper in 1990, where they sort of added a couple more roles to the presidency. So in 88, it was basically just two things: safeguarding the reserves and having a non-concurrence power over key appointment holders, right? By the time it came to the second white paper, they added on concurrence for continued detention under the Internal Security Act, and they added on the issuing of restriction orders under the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. And so by 1991, the Constitution was amended, and the elected presidency was created. This was a massive amendment. It is the most massive amendment we've had for the Constitution. It added 30% more content to the Constitution itself. What then happened after 1991, right, was a kind of clawing back, and suddenly the nightmare scenario looked less and less likely, I think. And so the government, the PAP government, began to think maybe we overdid it. Maybe we put in too many checks and balances. And of course, you had the problem when President Ong Teng Cheong was elected in 1993, and he began to ask for information, challenging the way they compute reserves and so on and so forth. And they thought, oh my goodness, this is getting a little bit problematic. Maybe we scale back. So in 1994, the first thing they did was they removed spending on defense and security out of the president's scrutiny. In other words, bills for those kinds of spending do not require the president's assent. They also the problems that President Ong also had, and Cherian mentioned this at his introduction, which is when I among other lawyers got involved with trying to help President Ong, was in Constitutional Reference number 1 of 1995. At that time the office was really quite primitive. He had hardly any staff, and he certainly had no legal advisors of any sort. So we all kind of volunteered our services. And then later on, in 1996, there was an amendment to provide for parliamentary override of the president's veto over certain public appointments. And then in 2008, they amended the provisions relating to the reserves on the utilization of 50% of the so-called net investment income, which is basically accumulated funds from interest earned on your investments rather than on capital, right? And then finally, in 2016, another major change to the Constitution following the Menon Constitutional Commission report, and they amended it in two very significant ways. One, to tighten three significant ways. One, tighten the requirements of the private sector candidates. Two, to provide for ethnically based reserve elections, and three, actually, which I will talk a little bit about afterwards, giving a much larger role to the Council of Presidential Advisors. Okay, so this is the journey that we took. And so very quickly, what were the changes that were made and what are the requirements? This is something that's very much in the news today because, everybody is wondering, will George Goh qualify or not? Nobody asked that about Tharman because quite clearly he falls within one of these categories that's sort of automatic qualification. The term of the office was 6 years. You must be a Singapore citizen, age 45 and above. That's not hard. You get there eventually. You must satisfy the Presidential Elections Committee that you are a person of integrity, good character, and reputation. And you will be elected by the citizens of Singapore. The most difficult part of this, of course, is that you have to show that you have held high office for not less than 3 years under a list that's prescribed in Articles 19.3 and 19.4. In summary, the list I'll show you later on, but the Presidential Elections Committee is provided for under Article 18, and It's made up of 6 members: Chairman of the Public Service Commission, 1 Chairman of ACRA, a member of the Presidential Council of Minority Rights, nominated by the chairman of that council, a member or former member of the Council of Presidential Advisors, nominated by the chairman of the CPA, a person who is qualified to be a High Court judge, nominated by the Chief Justice. Doesn't have to be a judge, just need to be qualified to be one. And finally, a private sector member appointed by the Prime Minister. The job of this committee is to make sure that the presidential candidate actually satisfies all these constitutional requirements. The PEC can regulate its own procedure, fix a quorum for meetings, and it has a power to act notwithstanding any vacancy or of its membership, which is a little bit odd, right? I mean, can you imagine having a meeting with just sort of 3 out of 6 members? In any case, any decision of the PEC under the Constitution says it shall be final and shall not be subject to appeal or review in any court. And that gives many people the idea that, well, it's a final decision, nothing can be done. Well, not under administrative law, no, and I can say a little bit about this later on. If indeed it is thought that the PEC had acted irrationally, you can, in my view, challenge that decision. So what are these qualifications? You've got the automatic qualifications, that's to be seen in white. So if you have at least 3 years as Minister, Chief Justice, Speaker, Attorney General, Chairman of the Public Service Commission, Auditor General, Accountant General, or Permanent Secretary, you automatically qualify. Likewise, if you were chairman or CEO of any of these boards, right, as the Central Provident Fund Board, the HDB Board, the Jurong Town Corporation, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the GIC, and Temasek Holdings. Not difficult. These are automatic qualifications. You just need to show that you've been there, done that, right? Now, all these, mind you, are intended to be some kind of proxy for the administrative ability to balance, as you may recall, right, between political expediency and public interest. And that's all it means. So there is some built-in assumption that if you were a Speaker of Parliament, you have this wisdom and ability to do this, right? Likewise, if you were the Attorney General. However, when you come to the private sector, this becomes rather difficult, right? So the chairman and you need to be currently under the Article 19.4, you have got to be a chairman or CEO of a company registered under the Companies Act with paid up, sorry, so not paid capital, this should be shareholder equity of at least $500 million, right? And this amount, interestingly, can be increased if all the members of the Presidential Elections Committee present a recommendation to Parliament and Parliament resolves to do so. So this is like a moving target, right? Because although it now says 500, this can always be changed, right? Prior to 2016, the requirement was a company should be a paid up capital of 100 million. So this has escalated to a very, very high point, okay? Then there is the really deliberative track, as it's called by the Menon Commission, which is that under Article 19.4b, Part 2, Clause 2, the Presidential Elections Committee is satisfied, having regard to the nature of the office, the size and complexity of the private sector organization, and the person's performance in the office, that the person has experience and ability that is comparable to the experience and ability of a person who has served as chief executive of a typical company with at least the minimum amount of shareholder equity that satisfies paragraph A, which is the 500 million, right? So this is really quite interesting, right? They don't say that your experience should be equivalent to that of a minister, equivalent to that of an attorney general or speaker. No. You've got to be equivalent to that of a CEO of a company with shareholder capital of at least 500 million. So this, from all we have been reading, appears to be the section that the candidate George Goh will probably rely on for his application. All right, we can talk about this if we want later on. The important thing that got changed, of course, is the reserve election. And here, even the Menon Commission was very perplexed and was very concerned, because you see, and this was something which we had pointed out in the early 1990s already. In fact, after the first white paper, I think I wrote a comment on this about that the moment you make an office competitive, you cannot really play with the symbolic role. It is notable, for example, that in the first 3 presidents of Singapore, we strenuously tried to ensure that the majority race did not occupy the office. So Yusof Ishak was Malay, was the first president, followed by Benjamin Henry Sheares, a Eurasian, and then C.V. Devan Nair, who's a Malayali. And then finally, you had a Chinese in Wee Kim Wee, but he's not just any Chinese, he's a Peranakan Chinese, right? So it's this symbolism is a very important thing for a multiracial society, but you can't do this sort of round robin, take your turn kind of game if you make it competitive, because when you make it competitive, then the ethnicity of the candidate becomes secondary. The capability under Article 19 becomes primary. So they decided, no, we still don't want to make sure that, you know, all the races get a chance at being president. And so this was inserted in 2016. And of course, it's very controversial because it just presupposes that, race or ethnicity, which is a social construct, can really be defined, and it becomes so ridiculous at some point, because it says, well, first of all, they restricted to community only means 3 types of communities, or 3 sub 4. One, your Chinese community or a Malay community, and then there's the Indian, and then there's the other minority community. So that's all there is, right? You got to fit into one of these things, otherwise you cannot be a president, right? Presumably. And so what are you? Are you a Chinese? Are you a Malay? Are you an Indian, or so-called others? What does that mean? The Constitution tries to solve this problem by making a definition, but it's a rather tautologous kind of definition, right? A person belonging to the Chinese community means any person, right? So this is self-identity, considers himself to be a member of the Chinese community, and who is generally accepted as a member of that Chinese community by that community. Oh, okay. It's tautologous, but I suppose at some point it's obvious who a Chinese is, right? Never mind. The Malay definition is even more problematic. A person belonging to the Malay community means a person whether of the Malay race or otherwise. Now, this is the only one that has whether of that race or otherwise, right? In other words, we don't really care whether you are Malay or not. You are Malay if you say you're a Malay, and the Malay community generally accept you as a member of the Malay community. This is really a problem. If I can't define a singular, how do I define the collective? Help me out, somebody. I don't know how to do this. Finally, the Indian or other minority community. Again, they say that you're a member of the Indian community who is generally accepted. That's the same as the Chinese community. But in the case of other minority, there's no need to be accepted by members of that community, whatever it is. Okay, so this is what is in the Constitution, and quite clearly quite problematic. So what have we got since then? Because it provides for, if you a particular community has not held the office of president for the 5 most recent terms, then that would be reserved for that community. So if you just look at the various presidents, I suppose that's why we had a reserve election in 2017, because the last Malay to occupy the position was Yusof Ishak in 1970, and then that was more than 5 terms prior to the 2017 election. The changes to the presidential power, I've tried to do this in the table form, hopefully, so that we are very clear about this. I don't know how to make it clearer, but if we look at the first few lines, right, they run right across. These are powers that the president always had. That means whether it's before 1991 or 2016 or whatever it is, the president has always had these discretionary powers, right? Which is that you can appoint the prime minister and you can withhold consent to request a dissolution of parliament. These are traditional, what we might call Westminster constitutional type of prerogative powers of the head of state. Otherwise, it says in the Constitution, and it's still there in Article 21(1), except as provided by the Constitution, the president shall act in accordance with the advice of the cabinet or of a minister acting under the general authority of the cabinet. All right, what has happened since 1991 when we amended the Constitution? Well, there are several new powers given under these various articles. I don't want to go into them, but basically they are about the drawdown of reserves. First, the appointment of key members of the civil service and the judiciary and the military and so on. And then finally, two other tack-on functions on the continued detention under the Internal Security Act and restriction orders under the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. What happened in 2016, as I mentioned just now, was the role that's played by the Council of Presidential Advisors, which is a non-elected body. Okay. All right, let's move on. So what are these new powers? You can withhold assent on any bill under the following articles. Well, let's not go through them. They're basically about what I've told you about just now, right? Otherwise, it'd take too long. Now, I wanted to flag this one where you have now this Council of Presidential Advisors, which is acting almost as a check against the president. Okay. So previously, you had the problem of a Westminster constitutional system whereby the government, once you are in power, you have almost untrammeled power. In other words, if you decide you want to spend, if you want to go into deficit spending, you have no problem doing that. There is no constitutional restraint against you doing that. Okay. And so obviously Lee Kuan Yew thought, well, this is a bit dangerous because if you get, a spendthrift government, you can come in here and basically, spend everything that we've accumulated over the years. So what they did was to have the president check on parliament. All right. But now you've got president checking on parliament, but you're not sure about the president. So you create another body called the Council of Presidential Advisors to check on the president. So between 1991 and 2016, the Council of Presidential Advisors was really just to offer advice, nothing else. And the president was not compelled to ask for advice. Okay, but you had this body that would provide advice if the president should ask for it. Okay, by 2016, they had enlarged the Council of Presidential Advisors. So now you've got 8 members, 3 appointed by president, 3 appointed on the advice of the prime minister, 1 appointed on the advice of the chairman of the PSC, 1 appointed on the advice of the Chief Justice. So 8 appointees. No one went for election. And what happens then is that the Constitution now mandates that the president must consult the CPA before exercising his discretion, her discretion, except in 5 limited places: concurrence on CPIB investigations, restraining order under the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, appointment of your personal staff, well, sure. And then, of course, the 2 traditional powers that the president always had: appointment of prime minister, dissolution of parliament. The CPA must then indicate what advice they gave the president and whether that advice is unanimous. And if the president exercises his or her discretion contrary to the advice of the CPA, then you trigger another mechanism, which means then Parliament can, by 2/3 majority, override the president's non-concurrence. Okay. So this is, that's why I say you have president checking parliament, and then now you have an unappointed body checking the president. Okay. So yeah, so that sort of gives you the broad flavors of the office. What are the persistent issues and difficulties? The first one is this problem of entrenchment, right? Remember, Lee Kuan Yew said we have to entrench it in there because you don't want them to alter the constitution, get rid of the president, abolish the office, and then, you know, raid the larder anyway, right? So what you didn't, and the way they did it was to make the president's powers very difficult to amend. Under the original scheme in 1991, there was something called Article 52A. It says if the president refuses to assent the bill to amend his powers, this can only be overridden if the parliament submits a bill to national referendum and is supported by 2/3 of the total number of votes cast. This was the old Article 52A. It was enacted in 1991 and it was kept in abeyance for 25 years. In other words, they enacted it, but they never brought it into force. Okay. And then finally, when they made the major amendment in 2016, they abolished 52A, replaced it with Articles 5A, 5B, 5C. Now, if you go to the AGC website, you will not find 5A, 5B, 5C. It's very tricky. I don't know why in this consolidation, in this particular reprint of the Constitution, they simply left it out. So you would need to go back to the 2016 amendment to read the terms of Articles 5A, 5B, and 5C. But in summary, it is similar to the old 52A, but they break it up. But more significantly, no longer do you need 2/3 majority at a referendum to override the presidential veto. You now need only more than half, right? So that threshold has been lowered. Why do you enact something? So is 5A, B, and C in force? No, it's not in force. Has it been enacted? Yes. Is it part of the Constitution? Yes, it is. So why is it not in force? Now, it is not uncommon for laws to be enacted but kept in abeyance. This is done very often in relation to sort of new criminal laws that are sort of more regulatory. Right? I mean, so if you had a situation where you're introducing a new law and you want people to get used to it, you might enact the law, which means that yes, the law is there, but you may say, well, let's postpone its coming into force for 6 months. And in the interim 6 months, you launch a education campaign, you know, make sure people comply. You know, I suppose if you want to enact a law about returning your trays at the hawker center, then you might do something like this, right? You don't fine people straight away because they're not used to it. So you give them warning during the 6 months, and then in a 6-month period, bam, the law comes into force, and then I can issue you a ticket if you fail to comply. So why would you do this, right? The government never explains. They keep saying, well, maybe we need to tinker. I mean, seriously, you tinker something like this for 30 years? Not very convincing. Well, my guess is that you keep it in abeyance. How do you bring a law into force? The minister simply needs to gazette it, right? No need to even call parliament. So my guess is if indeed you lose an election or you get a freak result, the caretaker minister can immediately gazette it and bring this into force. And during the time, you cannot get rid of the president. The second persistent problem is the problematics of the proxy of the candidate requirements, right? Why is it that it's so easy on the public sector side to become a presidential candidate, but it make it harder and harder on the private sector side? Exactly what proxy are you using? I pointed this out in the 2016 Constitutional Commission. I said even the automatic qualification, I couldn't see what special abilities or experience a speaker or parliament had in relation to the kind of judgment calls that you require, right? But I don't think anyone was keen to answer that question because I think everybody knew who the next candidate was going to be. Yeah, so why, what's the, if you're looking at budgets, then you say, yeah, sure, minister runs big ministry, big budget. I can understand this, but budget of parliament is like 18 million, right? Anyway, that's the problem with the proxy. How do you equate that even with a private sector? And my argument had always been by increasing, I mean, they kept saying, oh, but suddenly there are so many big companies. So what if there are so many companies? Are you trying to keep the pool limited? Because if that's the case, then you can keep increasing the amount of shareholder capital for the sole purpose of narrowing the pool, keeping it very small so that less and less people are likely to want to challenge the likely candidates that will come from the government side. The third problem is achieving the mandate. Remember, again, one of the overriding institutional design considerations was that you must have a strong moral mandate to be able to check the government. Well, how do you check this government? I mean, if you look at the last election, right? Okay, so what's a mandate? Well, if you have a and let's just talk about this mathematically, although we have a real life illustration. Mathematically, if there are only two candidates, whoever wins will always have a majority. That's without a doubt, right? But the moment you have more than two, right? We had 4 in 2011, and you end up with nobody getting an absolute majority. So although you win, first past the post system, Tony Tan won 35.2%, but technically speaking, there's 64.8% who did not vote for Tony Tan. In other words, you are a minority. So how much mandate do you have, right? And so, in fact, a number of us proposed, and I was very strong on proposing this, to have a runoff system. In other words, and the French use this very, 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 very regularly. You can have 100 candidates, never mind, right? But at the end of the day, after round 1, the 2 highest candidates will go into round 2. And everyone else who's voted for the other 98 will redistribute their votes among the top 2 candidates. And whoever wins, because there's only 2, mathematically, you will always have a majority. I was roundly told off by Chan Heng-chi. She said, well, a win is a win anyway, right? What are you grumbling about? My point was, well, yeah, sure, a win is a win, but I think if I won, I would like to win with more than 50% than less than 50%, right? Anyway, that's how they think. The other point that I wanted to make was what happens when you don't have an election. So this happened, of course, in 1999 for 2 elections. No one stood against S.R. Nathan, right? So did he have a total percentage? Was it 100% because no one stood against him? Because under the Presidential Elections Act, it's anyone, if you're the sole candidate, you will be declared having been elected. I had proposed this. Actually, it wasn't just my idea. One of my ex-colleagues, Val Winslow, highlighted this to me. He says, hey, why don't we follow the Korean system? The South Korean constitution, under Article 67.3 says, if and when there is only one presidential candidate, he shall not be elected president unless he receives 1/3 of the total eligible vote. In other words, you just go for some kind of like an almost endorsement exercise. And I actually had proposed this to President Nathan, not President Nathan, but I proposed this as a tweak to the system. And I think President Nathan didn't take too kindly with it, because after that he kept telling everybody, every time he sees me, he says, oh, this man thought I wasn't properly elected, right? And it was getting a bit grating after a little while. And then finally, one day I said, sir, I never said you are not properly elected. I just said you're not elected, right? Now, the fourth problem is gridlock. Is it possible to avoid a gridlock? Do you want to end up with a situation where you need to get rid of the president or you need to get rid of the presidency, right? The PAP had only one scenario in mind. If you have a bad government, meaning non-PAP, right? Look at the quadrant, the first quadrant, the maroon one. And in order to control that bad government, you have a so-called good president, and Ersatz PAP good man, right? The idealized, the PAP made flesh, so to speak. And this Ersatz PAP person will control the bad government, make sure you don't overspend, make sure you don't appoint your cronies into key positions of power. But if there's good and bad, there are 4 possible scenarios. It's not just one. you can have good government and good president. You can still clash. That's what happened to Ong Teng Cheong. And then what happens if your good government, by that definition, i.e. PAP government, you have a non-PAP endorsed president? That's not good, right? This guy will just wreak havoc, right? How do you do it? What are you going to do about this? And now, of course, the big question mark is if you have bad government, good, bad president. I don't know. That one maybe by that time, is a lost cause. But anyway, and so finally, I just want to end off with two other sort of persistent difficulties. I'm sorry, I've kind of taken up more time than I wanted to, but the first thing is it possible for the government to circumvent the scrutiny of the president? In other words, okay, if you stop me from spending the reserves, then I won't spend the reserves. Maybe I'll just make more money. And it's certainly possible to do that, right? I mean, you can grant another 2 casino licenses. That will bring in quite a lot of money. You could subdivide land and alienate it. Not necessarily sell it, but maybe lease it out long term. You could do a number of things which I think it's still possible to circumvent the presidential scrutiny and still make a mess of things, right? Is it an adequate check against the government, all right? One of the things that you will notice is that the checks and balances pertain mainly to budgets, appointments to key statutory boards, and so on. But there is hardly any check, in fact, no check on how government funds are actually being utilized, being invested. And here, when you talk about sovereign wealth funds and so on, there is no check. So in that sense, you can put another 10 locks in the front door, but if the back door is open, you could still face financial problems. And finally, and this is where I think candidates would invariably try to redefine the role when they go into elections. There's a lot of unenumerated roles of the president. When I say not unenumerated, I mean it is not there provided for in the constitution. So the fact that the president represents Singapore at international events, the president receives ambassadors, and so on. The president, is the patron of the presidential charities and so on. All that is not enumerated. So this is where I think there's still, a lot to be said for roles that the president can perform, and and because it's such a gray area, it's possible also to overstep. So, in fact, a number of colleagues of mine asked me, "Hey, President Halimah going on about caning rapists." And so on. Is she allowed to say that? Well, there's nothing in the constitution that says you can't do that. She's not initiating policy. She can't initiate policy. It's not as if she could amend the law. So I suppose that's okay. But is it something that you want to step into the sort of policy realm, right? Do you want to get into the political thicket, so to speak? So that it remains a big question. So let me end my talk here and then turn the chair back to Cherian and then to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. And perhaps you can stop sharing your screen.
I'm trying to stop sharing, but it won't stop.
It's a persistent screen. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yes.
Right. So thanks so much for that whirlwind tour of the last 30 plus years of our experiment with this huge piece of constitutional innovation. Yeah. Kevin and I had this agreement that we would then segue now into a conversation. I should explain that we are old friends. We can talk for hours, but I promise we'll try not to forget there's also an audience. So, but I do have the pleasure of chopping you, monopolizing you for the upcoming minutes as I try to tease out some of the fascinating issues that you brought up. I mean, I liked very much your identification of this mega trend, right? So here's an institution that was built on the fear that Singapore needs to avoid this nightmare scenario of rogue government that can do whatever it wants with the reserves and so on. Yeah. And so you institute what you call PAP made flesh in one man as a kind of a custodian guardian against this. I should clarify to Gabriel Sim, who did ask in the Q&A about what you mean by good president and a bad president. I think I know what Kevin meant. You got to think about it in terms of the PAP's own perspective.
Yes.
Right? It's not Kevin is saying this is a good government or bad government. It's from the PAP's
It's not my judgment
right?
call. It is their perception, right? So if you are not
right. So,
from my party, then you're not good. I mean, that's
so a good government would be as austere, as disciplined, as long-term in its thinking as the PAP is. Similarly, a good president would have those kinds of values embodied in them. A bad government would be populist, would be spendthrift, and so on. Yeah.
Profligate is the word they love to use.
This year, this nightmare scenario has moved over the last few years, and I think you're right that increasingly the government maybe sees that that's not actually of immediate concern. The concern now is flipped. What if we continue to have a good government in charge? We don't want a bad president to mess with us. Yeah, bad in two ways. One, in the Ong Teng Chong mode, perhaps the right values and so on, but too active, too capo. Yeah, but more recently, bad in another sense, maybe too populist, maybe too keen to capitalize on the frustrations that Singaporeans have with our very austere, hard-nosed government. Yeah, so I agree with you. There's been this big shift in the government's thinking of what actually is the nightmare scenario, and this anxiety, I think, was reflected in a recent post just last week by Ho Ching. I want to share this with you because I think it's worth discussing. She, I guess, was trying to argue that the president does not need to get that involved, right? Does not need to be so capable. It is possible to make judgment calls about whether spending is necessary, whether we need to take the goodies out of the house without actually going in to check the size of the reserves and so on, right? So this is her sense of what kind of president we need or don't need. I found this interesting because, in fact, as I understand it, this was a question that did arise in the Ong Teng Chong presidency. Can you explain to us how this was resolved?
Okay. So one of the problems, of course, well, I think the analogy which Ho Ching has highlighted is a little bit overly simplistic, because the reserves are not like the contents of a house. Well, first of all, if you ask somebody to jaga the house, you better know which house you're jagaing to start with, right? So you need to know what is it that you're supposed to look after, right? Is this is this house just what it sits on, or this expanse of land which it occupies? Does it include the trees, the hedges, the driveway, the long winding driveway? What does it include? So you've got to figure out what's the house about. But there the analogy stops, because when we talk about reserves, it's a very, very complex thing, because you're looking at what you're holding in terms of fixed assets as well as movable assets. Okay, fixed assets, land. You could own hotels, you could own chunks of land. In fact, during Ong Teng Chong's time, the government said there are over 50,000 parcels of different pieces of land that the government is holding, both in Singapore and abroad. You're looking at capital, and capital can reside in equity, stocks and shares. It can be in treasury bills, bonds. It could exist in some other kind of liquid assets, right? You could hold gold or silver or any other precious metal commodities. So it's not so simple as to say, no, you don't really need to know, because you can just make sure they don't draw down on it, right? So how do you know whether there is a drawdown or not a drawdown? You need to know, well, you know, what was there and what was taken away. I mean, you know, I'm putting it overly simplistically, but it's a very complex thing. In fact, this led to a document which is very little known, command paper of 1999, right? And this is an almost 50-page document that was issued by the government. It's called the Principles for Determining and Safeguarding the Accumulated Reserves of the Government and the Fifth Schedule of Statutory Boards and Government Companies. And there in here,
sorry, and this, am I right? This was a result of the dispute with Ong.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
After the problem with President Ong, they came up with this, and they made President Ong, well, President Ong agreed to sign it, and it was signed between him and Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong.
And can, constitutionally, can the president now ask what's in the reserves?
Sure. Of course you can. I mean, under the Constitution, you have a provision which the president can ask for information, and in that respect, the president can pretty much ask for almost anything, right? But even if you spell out certain things in here, I mean, this is like an accounting document, you know, and so you know, you need to ask for this information. And for example, it says, what constitutes assets? Loans repayable to the government as listed in the statement of loans repayable to the government. Well, you got to go and ask for this document, you got to read it, and then say, aha, that's part and parcel of our assets. So it's actually quite a gargantuan task, actually, to know what's in the reserves, what's computed, what's included, what's not included. I mean, if the government decides tomorrow that, you know, they want to sell all the black and white bungalows that it owns, would that be in some way a drawdown in reserves? Right? Because if you hold it in fee simple, which is freehold, it might appreciate in value much more than if you liquidate them now. Is that a drawdown in reserves? Well, I don't know the answer, right? But you need to figure that out.
Okay. As a way to help clarify what the president can or cannot do, I'm going to present you with 5 scenarios, okay, which you have seen before. I've prepared you already, and I want to ask if in each of these scenarios, is the president being naughty or nice? Yeah, the government does something, president does something else. Tell us, would you rate the president's conduct green, something definitely okay, observing the letter and spirit of the law? Is it red, definitely not okay, violating the Constitution? Or is it somewhere in between, amber, flashing yellow lights, maybe legal, but possibly controversial? Yeah. So here's the first one. So the government wishes to appoint a new director of Temasek Holdings. The president blocks the appointment, saying that the individual is underqualified and seems to have been picked for his loyalty to the prime minister.
Yeah, I should preface this, Cherian, from before, when I gave you a very quick response to it, just sort of off the cuff, that I should preface this by saying that whenever an appointment comes before the president must actually bring this matter to the Council of Presidential Advisors first, right? And so, so at that point, whatever the reason given by the president, provided that now, of course, if he says this is the reason, I'm blocking this person because he or she is underqualified and seems to have been picked for loyalty to the PM, and if the Council of Presidential Advisors agrees, then there wouldn't be a problem. Okay, because there is no real benchmark for the exercise of this discretion. It just has to be within logic, within reason. It should not be entirely irrational. So in this case, So you could say he'll be green, and if the CPA doesn't agree, he'll be overridden by Parliament.
Right. Okay. But you wouldn't say that the president would be overreaching by wanting to do this.
I think it's a bit borderline, but no, I don't think so.
Okay. Okay, next one. Parliament passes a new bill. Let's call it the Artificial Intelligence Security Bill. President refuses to give her assent, saying that the bill favors Western tech companies and is biased against Chinese.
Well, President cannot refuse assent to any bill. So the answer is no.
Because this is not a supply bill and so on.
Yes, that's right. It's not within
Okay.
the president's discretionary power.
Next. After opening a new children's charity, the president posts this on Instagram. I'm burdened by shame that the elites in our country, one of the richest in the world, consider it okay to let children go to bed hungry. It's not charity they need. They have rights. They deserve dignity.
But this is absolutely fine. I think you're not setting an agenda. You're not stepping onto legislative toes. I think this is fine.
This is kind of similar to the example that you cited with President Halima, expressing a strong view.
Yes, although here is a little bit different, because what President Halima said had to do with an existing law, which says that if you're male and you're above the age of 50, you will not be subject to caning. So what she's saying actually goes beyond this. She is actually suggesting that the law ought to be changed. Here, well, they have rights, they deserve dignity.
If this post came in the context of an ongoing debate over whether the government doesn't have enough social safety nets and so on, this could veer into being very, very political, even though it's a step.
Political, but it's probably still green.
So, okay, you would rate as green.
Bordering on orange, yes, okay.
Okay. Earlier you told me orange, so I didn't prepare a slide that said green. But you're entitled to change your mind. That's fine.
My apologies. Okay. I'm entitled to change my mind.
I'm thinking that even the context that you of President Halima's remarks. It strikes me that so much does depend on the personalities involved, right? What President Halima said was not earth-shaking in a sense. It didn't spark a major controversy that reverberated across the political landscape and so on, right? Because I guess in that case, there's no real suspicion by anyone that her statement would be undermining the authority of the prime minister or cabinet. Right. Simply because of who she is, right? It's not known as someone who was, she was never in cabinet in the first place, right? But it would be different in today's context, wouldn't it? Because, and this actually leads me to a question that was posed by one of our audience members, which was this, put it very bluntly, would Tharman become more important than Lawrence, and what could this lead to? Yeah. Even a very gentlemanly opinion expressed by hypothetical President Tharman could have reverberations simply because of his stature, relative to a very new prime minister. This is actually not an entirely new or hypothetical situation, because actually it's what we were prepared for with the person that we thought would be the first president, because for years, as those of us who are old enough know, for years the speculation was that Lee Kuan Yew would be our first president. And so for years, we were thinking about the possibility of a size 10 shoe Lee Kuan Yew in the presidency, with Goh Chok Tong as prime minister. Well, to Lee Kuan Yew's credit, though, when he moved out of the prime ministership, he took pains to avoid, for example, commenting on local politics for years.
Yes, that's right.
It was some years before he made even his first parliamentary speech, right? He devoted himself mainly to being a kind of a roving ambassador for Singapore, dealt with international issues, not with domestic ones and so on. Is that the kind of thing that you would expect President Tharman to do just out of consideration for his his much more junior prime ministerial partner?
Wow. I mean, I think they are quite different things altogether. Well, first of all, you're right. I mean, I think Tharman is certainly a person of great stature and standing. And I think whatever it is, as a matter of personality, first of all, he's a 3G leader as opposed to Lawrence Wong, who will be a 4G leader, right? So there's already sort of that age and innate kind of difference between the two of them. What does it mean to say that you are more important or not? They perform very different roles, right? Will he be more prominent? I suppose that may be one question, and maybe people are then looking to Tharman and saying, well, we're not happy with something that the cabinet is doing. What have you got to say about it? Well, maybe in that way, I suspect that and here I'm treading on very, very shaky ground because I'm not a political scientist, right? I'm just trying to look at it from a sort of a legal, commonsensical point of view. I think people might expect Tharman to make policy statements, which he shouldn't be, right? He shouldn't be. That's the cabinet's job. That's not for the president to do. But that could be the expectation simply because of who he is and what he's been doing for the last 20 years, right? Will he be more important? Well, I think that's.
I think you're right. I mean, it is a real dilemma because on the one hand, the reality that, as you described, is that he would need to be very careful about not upstaging the new prime minister, and yet the expectations are such that if indeed a large number of Singaporeans vote for him, it is because they expect something from him other than just only speaking up when reserves are being drawn and so on.
Right, exactly.
So I would expect that many people would be disappointed if he indeed did what I think most analysts would consider the responsible thing of exercising extreme restraint to allow his this young prime minister to fill the space. Yeah.
Right.
Let me move on to fourth scenario. Which is this. So the president blocks the PM's choice of chief justice, questioning the individual's suitability. Again, maybe claiming lack of competence. Months later, though, the president reveals in an interview the real reason. And the real reason is this: if you study this this individual's public statements, you'll see she does have radical ideas about marriage. She fundamentally does not believe marriage must be between a man and a woman. The PM's choice may be popular with liberals, but I had a duty to protect Singapore's family values.
Yeah. Again,
okay, not okay.
This would you could say this, but you see, by this time, a few months later, again, that would presuppose that this person has already been blocked, which means that chances are the CPA has agreed with the president's decision, right? In which case, well, you could tell people what the reason was, but it's probably not politically savvy to review these reasons. But I suppose if the CPA agreed with the president and there's no parliamentary override, it will be okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So politically controversial.
Politically not very wise, but I suppose
it would not be illegal, right?
I don't think
I raised the couple of appointment scenarios because I think that is something that's been kind of untested.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And when in fact the president does have tremendous power to block quite a number of appointments,
yes.
Even if not them get them through CPA, but he could make life pretty difficult for a government by blocking a number of appointments.
Absolutely, yes. And I think that's exactly the point. I think one part of the LKY speech in the IPS forum that I didn't quote, he says, look, you can't just replace the commander of the army and so on and so forth. No, the president will block. Right, so there was an intention that the president would block for whatever reason, right? Yeah.
Okay. So now, Kevin, I want to transition to questions from the audience, starting with a couple that arrived earlier on, and also one that
Okay, for some reason, my chat and my Q&A doesn't seem to be moving, so I'll have to rely on you to tell me what.
So no problem, I'll do that.
Yeah.
So these are questions that have to do with the president, presumably someone from the PAP. Will such a president be able to really distance themselves from the government? Yeah. So here are two comments that came earlier.
Okay, I think they're related, but a little bit different questions.
Yeah, and here's another one that came on the same general theme, right? How do we deal with presidents that have prior political affiliations?
Well, I think all I can say is that in many instances, institutions take on a life of their own, and the people who occupy these institutions may cleave to it. Okay, I mean, we've seen this happen with the appointment of judges to the U.S. Supreme Court. You think you're appointed a Republican judge, and suddenly the judge becomes very democratic in his or her holdings, right? We had the case of President Ong Teng Cheong. I mean, many of us will remember immense doubt as to whether or not Ong Teng Cheong, a former prime minister, could possibly divorce himself completely from his political affiliations from the PAP to take on an independent role. And he did. I mean, I worked with him. I can tell you he took his job really, really seriously, and he was always under siege. I mean, I must say, I took my hat off to him because he was under tremendous pressure to do what he wanted to do. I mean, he was being told by civil servants, "Oh, can you stop this? You're just being an irritant. Why are you checking us? That's for the bad guys, not us, right? We are the good guys." So this was the kind of thing that President Ong was having. And so you can see that notwithstanding that you have prior affiliations, you are able to do your job. But that's the reality. The perception would still be difficult. Now, frankly, if there had not been this very public sort of statement given by President Ong, that famous interview with Asia Week, I don't think people would have thought that Ong Teng Cheong had done anything. And they were like, well, you know what, you think you expect him to do ex-PAP anyway, right? I mean, that would have been the impression. But because the disagreement came out quite publicly, I think that's when the public will realize that, hey, this man was really serious about doing his job. That's after the fact, right? That's after you're already in office. So if you're asking the question prior, what can Tharman do now to show that he's independent from party? I don't know, man. I mean, I have no idea. It's going to be tough, right? But if you can say, I'm somebody like Ong Teng Cheong, I'm, I don't know. You've got to make sure people believe you.
Right. Here's a question from a fellow academic and sometime politician, Paul Anand Tambaya. If there's a contested election and a non-PAP favored candidate is elected president, is there anything at all in the constitution to prevent the PAP from instantaneously amending the constitution and convert the role of president to a figurehead? I think the second one is the second question is a separate question, but let's focus on the first one.
Yeah, the first question.
How quickly can they actually?
No, they cannot. But like I said, they can bring Article 5A, B, and C into force immediately, and then try and do a referendum and get rid of the president.
They could.
Sure.
Right. It would be, well, this is a case of where this is something they could do legally, but of course it might be politically
exact a very high political price. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. What was the other question on the CPA, or we'll take that later, or what?
It seems
Paul's question.
unrelated, so let's
Okay.
skip that. We have more. One from Bertha Henson. The president's duties are rather opaque. We have no explanation for any yes or what happens behind the scenes. I assume she means yes to assenting to a bill and so on. Would you recommend more transparency so people can see the custodial powers rather than only see the ceremonial powers?
Well, first of all, if the president agrees, assents, or does not agree to any decision that is within his or her discretionary powers under the Constitution, the president is obliged to gazette those reasons. So that's very transparent. The reasons for agreeing a drawdown on the reserves, President Halimah had to gazette her reasons. It's there in the Gazette, the government Gazette. I mean, of course, I don't assume we all read the government Gazette before going to sleep, but I mean, it's there, right? And it is fairly transparent, yeah. But that is only where it pertains to the president's discretionary powers. If it's something that has nothing to do with discretionary powers, just normal assent, there's no reason for you to tell the public, because you have no choice. I mean, you have to take the advice of cabinet, and then when they send you the bill, you just sign.
Okay, I'm glad this question was asked by Ying Xiang Tao, because one thing we haven't really had time to discuss is the president's role with regard to civil rights. Yeah, and earlier on as well, someone sent us a question regarding capital punishment. Any comments on this, given the power conferred to the president under the ISA and to issue pardons for capital charges?
Unfortunately, okay, so there are two separate things, right? I mean, this is where I think some people think, making these requirements for the election of a president is an overkill, because you're giving this president very little to do, actually, right? There are two important roles, but in many other things where we would think that having the public behind you gives you a greater voice, the Constitution actually doesn't provide a greater voice. So let's take capital punishment, for example. Yes, we always say that the president grants clemency. It's always done in the name of the head of state, but that doesn't mean that the president has a personal role to play at all, right? The president has no role to play. The cabinet will advise, the cabinet will take the report from the courts, it will then formulate an advice, and it will advise the president whether or not to grant clemency in capital cases. Same thing with the Internal Security Act. Under the Constitution, for all those persons who are detained under the Internal Security Act, there's something called the review board that meets every 6 months. If the review board decides that this person is no longer a threat and should be released, and the cabinet says, no, we still want to retain, only at that point where there's a disagreement between the board and the cabinet does the presidential discretion kick in. If the board and the cabinet agree, if they both say, let's release this chap, or let's continue detaining this chap, the president has no role whatsoever. This, unfortunately or fortunately, is how the legal regime has been constructed. So yes, that's why the problem is you make it so hard to be president. You would think that this president has got a lot more to do than he or she is supposed to, but no.
Let me throw you a final scenario, which is this, yeah. So let's say Singapore is facing some catastrophe. The one I worry about is frankly a big volcanic eruption somewhere near us. The government wants to draw on the reserves to deal with this unprecedented months-long emergency, right? So the president gives her approval, but then adds this, that I regret I've been asked only for this much, right? The sum is inadequate to alleviate the people's suffering. I would have gladly assented to a much larger drawdown on reserves. Yeah. And I asked this question because, as we discussed, the scenario that the institution was developed presumes a spendthrift government and a responsible, austere, hard-nosed president. I think many Singaporeans actually calling for the reverse, that our government is too austere. We would want a president who actually encourages the government to use its key, Yeah.
Okay, here I have to give you a technical answer and it will be a red. You're not allowed to do this. The reason is very simple. In law, when you are given a discretion, that discretion must be exercised afresh in every instance you're called upon to exercise it. So in this particular case, she was asked, or the president, I mean, not necessarily she, but the president would be asked, can we draw down these reserves? The president's exercise of discretion is limited to, in this case, you're asking me to draw down the reserves. Should I allow it or not? It doesn't extend beyond that, right? Because that would be prejudging the next time you're going to be called upon to to exercise a discretion. So I have to say it's red because technically speaking, you would be prejudging and therefore you would be failing to exercise the discretion when the time comes.
So in your view, the president shouldn't be dealing with hypotheticals, right? You
That's
deal
right.
with each on a case by case at
That's
that
right.
time. You
Yeah.
can't even say what you will do in such a situation.
I mean, seriously, the president can tell the cabinet, hey, maybe you want to ask for more. You don't have to go out to the public and say that, because
Privately.
once
Okay,
you've
sure.
done that, then immediately the public will say, well, hang on, aren't you supposed to be exercising a discretion? The exercise of discretion is applying one's mind to the matter at the given time on the given subject matter, not deciding for all time, right? To say that, well, really, let's open the doors, right? So that's why I would say that that's dangerous and should not be allowed. Yeah.
Interestingly, the many members of the current government, or some members of the current government, back in 1999, seemed to offer a different interpretation of this. And I mentioned this to you in private recently. If you read the 1990 Select Committee
the
report,
debate on the
you'll
select
find
committee.
this interesting. You'll find this interesting exchange between cabinet members and Walter Woon. Right, so Walter Woon is trying to argue that we really need the president to be non-political. Yeah, Lee Hsien Loong then paints the scenario to explain why the presidency is inevitably, inherently political, right? So, in the scenario that Lee Hsien Loong paints is this: let's say the government wants to draw down billions of dollars for a mega project, a new airport, for example. The president blocks it. The government still wants to do it, and there's no meeting of minds. Yeah, how will this be resolved? Lee Hsien Loong says, well, it'll have to be at the next election, right? When the president's term is up, the government would probably put up its own favored candidate, and of course, this will be an election issue. That it would be entirely legitimate for the public to ask the two candidates, how would you stand on if this request to draw down the budget comes up again?
Well, you see,
and Lee Hsien Loong says, surely this will be a political issue. Surely this natural question is entirely legitimate for the candidates to actually say whether they would approve this drawdown or not. So politically, there's a very strong signal from at least the 1990 Select Committee report. This is entirely acceptable, but constitutionally, you're saying still that this is a problem.
Okay, there are two parts to my take on this. First of all, this is 1990. The constitution that was was amended has since been amended again, and so now the president is not as powerful as the president was in 1991. In other words, if the president says, no, I'm not going to give you your $5 billion, you got to make sure that the president is carrying his CPA along with it. If the CPA doesn't agree, Parliament can override. End of the story. Don't even need a referendum. So that's settled very easily. Don't need to wait 6 years. Don't need to wait for another president to come into power, right? As to the question of whether or not, at the point when the candidate campaigns, is the candidate acting politically by saying, if you elect me, I will give them the money? Well, I would be very careful about such a candidate, because you don't have the full command of the facts, and yet you're prejudging, you're making a judgment way in advance. I would be very careful voting for somebody like that, right? But
Although I would
yes,
put it to you that most Singaporeans would expect exactly that. And if candidates are not prepared to say what they stand for, what kind of spending they would agree to, the ordinary citizen, including myself, would probably find them to be rather evasive and so on. But you would want them to play by the book and only exercise.
I think, yeah, I think I would be very careful, because you shouldn't jump into the political fray, into a political question, if you are not in full command of the facts, right? I mean, wait till you become president and let them lay the whole plan before you, and maybe it's a sham. It may be a total sham. Then you've already promised the public to approve the sham. Well, good luck to Singaporeans then, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the very responsible and educational answer.
Well, no, it's
yeah, no, I think, you know, this process, of course, demands something of citizens as well as of the candidates, and I think it's important to remember that.
Right.
I'm going to end with this wrap-up question for you, right? Because we are running out of time. I'm sorry for those who were not able to have their questions answered live. You know, when I shared this event announcement on Facebook, someone asked, you know, what's the point of all this discussion? It's such a restrictive election system. Nothing we say here is going to change the outcome anyway. So let me put this question to you, Kevin. You're probably busy with a few other projects. There are many other ways you could have chosen to spend this evening. We're glad you're here. But why do you think it's important for citizens to understand the system's strengths and weaknesses when the truth is we have so little control over it?
Well, I think, well, I suppose there's a certain idealism involved in some of this. I mean, this is our country. It's our only country. It's ours. If we don't care, I don't know who would. And I think, you know, for someone like me who's been studying this institution for over 30 years, if we think we can add something to the conversation to make it better, it doesn't matter if it doesn't matter today, it could matter tomorrow. It doesn't matter that we've now been stuck with this presidency. I have been long advocating dropping it. This is what the Menon Commission recommended. Let's go back to having an elected president, an appointed president, have a separate body to worry about the reserves. You know, let's consider, I mean, how could we make a better form of government? We are a very unique society. You know, politics in Singapore is really, really quite unusual. You wouldn't see the kind of swings you might see in some other countries. We transited from a colonial society into a modern society without ethnically based political parties, not like some of our neighbors. We have managed to do things properly in some cases. In some cases, like in the elected president, I think we overthought the problem. I think the solution could be done in some other way. It would require some political will to do it. You know, we are seeing a transition in the government. The 2G, the 1G, the 3G may have thought, you know, whatever we are saying is pointless, but maybe the 4G might think otherwise. So yeah, we should care. It's our country. We have only one. And for those of us who pretend to be intellectuals, I think we should give our 2 cents worth, because we speak from some modicum of understanding, knowledge, and study.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I think the spirit behind Kevin's contribution this evening is the spirit that is behind everything we do at Academia SG.
Yes.
Linda Lim, Teo Yu Yen, Joanne Liao, and our assistants like Corey and, well, I forgot to mention Ian Chong, who's there as well. Thank you. all of us believe that our academic community can serve some value in public debates. And as long as there are Singaporeans and friends of Singapore who agree and tune in to what we have to offer, like this evening, we'll keep doing what we do. Our email newsletter is the best way to stay in touch. Please join our mailing list via our website, academia.sg. Until then, thanks again, Kevin, and bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks, Cherian.